So, hello everyone. For those of you that were here this morning, you know I'm the data editor at the Data and Research Unit at the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. We talked this morning about the Panama Papers and how that was done at a reporting level, but of course this was a big investigation focused on data, and I want to talk to you about the data work we did, but mostly about how you can find stories in the data. Helena is later going to talk about how she found stories in the data for The Guardian, and hopefully that will serve you as an example of how you can use the data too. This presentation, by the way, it's public, so if you go to that link bit.ly/ICIJ Nielsen, so that should be easy. You should be able to follow the slides and see the content there too if you want. I'll tweet it later if you want. So basically, let me just recap a little bit as a way of introduction. Basically, the data for the Panama Papers, the 2.6 terabytes of data, 11.5 million files, were received by these two guys, Bastian and Frederick Obermeier, two German reporters from Süddeutsche Zeitung, a newspaper based out of Munich in Germany, and they got a tip from somebody that wanted to share data. They said yes, and they ended up with what amounts to be the largest investigation based on a leak in journalism history. They could have done what I call Gollum Journalism, which is what many investigative journalists have done for a long time. Investigative journalism is mainly based on lone wolves working by themselves. So journalists who have very good sources, and most of you are journalists. You have an exclusive, and you hang on to it, like the ring, and you don't want to share it because it's your treasure, right? So instead of playing Gollum Journalism, they shared it with the ICIJ, and this amount of information was able to be understood, analyzed, and mined by more than 370 journalists in around 80 countries for a year. As we were saying this morning, this is the comparison of the leaks that we had been working on before, and it's clear how this amounts to something much, much, much bigger than what we had done before. Inside the 2.6 terabytes of information were mostly documents. This is a breakdown. You see that out of the 11, around half of the documents were emails. Then there were PDFs, images, text documents, and also database formats, and I'll get into that in a second. But of course, the first thing we had to do at ICIJ was process all that information, process those PDFs and those images so that the machine could read into them. And that was a lot of work. It took us around 1 or 2 months of work to actually process everything so reporters anywhere from the world could search inside them. And basically, so that we could put them in a platform like this. We were showing it this morning, but I wanted to go through it so you understand what reporters anywhere in the world could do with those 11.5 million files. Basically, they would be able to log into this platform that we call Blacklight due to the name of the software, open source software that we use, and basically you would put in a name and you would get search results. So pretty similar to any Google search. The difference is that the good thing about this platform, which is open source, and we improved it with our tech team, is that it allows you to do more complex searches. So if you're a non-tech savvy journalist and you think Google searches are the best thing you can do, then this tool is good for you. But then if you're a more tech savvy journalist, or I guess better at online research, you could do things like proximity searching. So for example, in this example, you could search Joaquin Loera proximity 2, so it would find Joaquin something Loera, like the case here, Joaquin Guzman Loera. I don't know if that name rings the bell to any of you. It's El Chapo Guzman, this drug how do you say, drug dealer that was arrested, and it was known, some months ago because Sean Penn did an interview, and remember this scandal. So basically, this drug dealer appears in the data, but he's Spanish, and we in Spain have long names. I've been introduced as Mar Cabra, but my full name actually is Maria del Mar Cabra Valero. So you would never find me in the data if you look me as Mar Cabra if you didn't have things like proximity matching. So it would allow us to do proximity matching like this, so you can find people with middle names. Hillary Rodham Clinton. If you search for Hillary Clinton, you would miss a document. But it also allowed us to do more complex things. So for example, thanks to a feature that we developed, reporters could give us a spreadsheet. Well, not give us, feed into the system a spreadsheet of names. Let's say the list of all the politicians in the UK, all the MPs in the UK, and feed it into the system, and within seconds, you get a list back of all the hits that you have in the data. So are those names in the data? That way you don't have to make 1,000 searches, whatever many searches, the system does it for you, right? These allowed us to do distributed reporting and then share the tips and exchange tips in a forum that we had to exchange communications. But we very quickly realized that on those documents was something that could be even more valuable for us and for the public, which was the database information in these documents. For ethical reasons, for legal reasons, ICIJ is not making public the 11.5 million files inside the Panama Papers. Mainly, to give you an example, out of the documents that we have, there are a lot of passports, a lot of bank accounts, names of minors. So it would be a bit of a legal nightmare, and also, ethically, questionable from an ethical perspective, although there are different takes on this. But from our point of view, we just decided that it was better not to publish all these documents dump it on the internet. We did not distribute information in mass, but we actually believe that transparency is important, especially if you are exposing a secret system like the offshore world. So the key in what we were able to make public was those database formats, which was basically around a third of the documents and basically connected to Mossack Fonseca's internal database. It was not in a database format, so we had to do a lot of reconstruction using other open source tools like this one, Talent, used for extract, transform, and load data. But after we transformed it and used a couple of tools like Linkurious to visualize it, and Neo4j is the database format behind it, we were able to have that data that was dispersed in different documents to put into a graph. So one of the tools we had for our reporters, and that is similar to the tool available now for everyone, was this graph database that allowed us to explore the offshore companies created by Mossack Fonseca in different offshore jurisdictions, 21 different jurisdictions, but also the people behind those companies. So in here, we see shareholders, we see addresses, we see entities, we see intermediaries. So this is an example of what you could see. And we thought, after getting legal advice, of course, that we were able to publish this to the world because in the end, this would be public if tax havens didn't sell secrecy. Tax havens sell secrecy, therefore, they don't have public corporate registries. Or most of them don't have public corporate registries, or when they have a public corporate registry, even if it's with a login like Panama, they only have information about nominees, so it's not very helpful. There's a lot of public debate, some public debate happening today in London in the anti-corruption summit that is happening today about what type of information should be publicly logged about corporations. Should we be able to access information about ownership? Should that be public? Should only governments have access to that? Therefore, we thought that it was legally safe, and not only legally safe, but also a transparency matter to publish this data. And because it makes you feel like have superpowers and see break through the secrecy of these offshore jurisdictions. Normally, how many of you, I'm sure that you relate to the fact that there's an offshore company that appears in an investigation, but it's in the BVI, it's a dead end in your investigation. If it's a British company, you can always go to Companies House, right? So we wanted to kind of like give those superpowers not only to our 370 journalists, but also to the world. And also, we also wanted to start tapping into the public's power to crowdsource tips and stories that we probably may have missed in this year of work. So on May 9th, that's this Monday, at 7 p.m. London, we released the Offshore Leaks database. It's actually a database that has information also from a previous investigation that we did. It was called Offshore Leaks, that had information on more than 100,000 offshore entities incorporated by other agents, registered agents, called Portcolis Trustnet and Commonwealth Trust Limited. And basically, we created the Offshore Leaks database with a new design and with now almost 320,000 offshore companies and trusts incorporated in many jurisdictions, from Panama to the Cook Islands to the British Virgin Islands, therefore allowing to break that secrecy that tax havens provide. These searchable database, which I'm going to demonstrate in a second, is not only searchable through our search engine and through our user interface. For us, it's very important that other people investigate: journalists, tax authorities, governments, prosecutors, financial regulators. I was just told today that the FCA, you say? Financial, well, how do you call it? But what is the... Right, the Financial Conduct Authority had asked banks to look if they were dealing with Mossack Fonseca, right? So that's helpful for banks too, for example. So we want people to be able to look into this like they would be able to look into any corporate registry. And in order to do that, and in order to tell you how to do that, and to give you some ideas so you get stories out of it, I need to explain a little bit what would you find in the Offshore Leaks database. In the Offshore Leaks database, we have 4 types of things, nodes, entities, 4 types of entities you'll find. You could find officers, which are people or corporations that basically are directors, shareholders, beneficiaries, authorized signatory of offshore companies, right? You have the offshore company itself, which we called entity, because it could also be a trust or a fund. And then we also had intermediaries, which were the people that made that possible. For example, HSBC or Coutts were 2 major banks that were incorporating companies through Mossack Fonseca for clients here in the UK. And then we have address. The address connected to any of these 3 entities. So how does normally the offshore secrecy work? So let's say I want to open up a bank account in Switzerland. Do I normally go to Switzerland with my name, Mar Cabra, or Maria del Mar Cabra Valero, and have a bank account in my name? Yes, I could do that. But what many people have done is, instead of going directly to Switzerland, I would go to Panama, for example, create a company called Sunny Sunshine Limited, and then Sunny Sunshine Limited is my parallel identity, and with that, I open up a bank account in Switzerland. How do I create an offshore company in Panama? Do I go to Panama? Do I do it online? Yes, I could do it online, but normally the normal process is I would go to an intermediary, HSBC, for example. HSBC would contact Mossack Fonseca, which is, a company with headquarters in Panama, and they would do the incorporation in the registry and also set up a system of nominees, normally as directors, so that my name is not traced anywhere. And then I get the company, right? So it's a system where there are several steps. Me as an officer, HSBC as an intermediary, Mossack Fonseca, that creates an entity. There was a lot of debate about whether we wanted to publish addresses or not. And we decided to publish addresses because it's the best way to identify if a person is a person, if that person. And therefore we published those addresses. Full disclaimer, we actually made a mistake when we released the database on Monday, and we actually had to run a correction on some addresses that were identified to the wrong people. But right now you have the full data and corrected data in the database, so you're able to use addresses to identify whether that person is that person. And important, don't forget to download, because you can download the data in the database. So you can work in your computer. So this is how it looks like. Basically, you can do two things in the database. You can either, or actually three things. You can enter any name here. See, one of the most searched things is Trump. People really want to know whether Donald Trump has offshores connected to the offshore world. Or you can say, okay, I want to know all the entities connected to the UK. So you would search United Kingdom and hit on search. And if you do that, here are all the offshore entities, officers, intermediaries, and addresses connected to the UK. Connected to the UK means that they are connected to an address in the UK, or that our computer has identified them as being in the UK. And then you would just click on one of those and see the information in it. Let's say you get lucky and you think, okay, I'm gonna search for Emma Watson, right? You see it there, but you're like a Harry Potter fan and you wanna know whether Emma Watson is in the data. You can search anywhere, all countries. You make a search and here she is, Emma Watson is in the data. If I'm not mistaken, the Times found it. And it was a big story here. You can see that Emma Watson is connected to one address, connected to one offshore entity, linked to the UK, that the data comes from Panama Papers, not the Offshore Leaks investigation, which, by the way, is current through 2015, which seems like yesterday for now, but in 2 years from now it will be old, probably. You can also search in Open Corporates to see if Open Corporates, the biggest corporate database in the world, open database about corporations in the world. And basically the idea is that you can keep clicking through to know more about Emma Watson or her company. So for example, here you see Emma Watson is connected to a London address and connected to a Falling Leaves Limited. Falling Leaves Limited, you can click on the dot to see that it's a company in the British Virgin Islands, incorporated on September 11th, 2013. It's active as of the end of 2015, and the data is from Panama Papers. If you double click on that, you see who else is connected to Falling Leaves. And here you see that there's another person that is now beneficiary, which actually ends up being the same. Because I'm guessing probably Emma Charlotte Duer Watson is her full name. And then there's another company, which actually if you expand, it seems to have a Jersey address. So probably you can go into the Jersey corporate registry to see what is it out there for Betel Trustees Limited. As you can see, the database seems pretty dirty, and Helena is going to talk more about that. The reason why there's an Emma Watson and an Emma Charlotte Duer Watson, it's because that's the way it was stored in Mossack Fonseca's internal database. We cannot assume it's the same person. We don't have unique identifiers to assume it's the same person. Therefore, we had to leave it like that. If you're interested in knowing more or working with that in a massive way, you just go to download data. And in here, you can download all the files in CSV. And you would get 5 CSVs. You get a CSV for all the officers, a CSV for all the intermediaries, a CSV for all the addresses, a CSV for all the entities, and a CSV for all the relationships between these 4 types of entities. And with that, you can start doing massive matches, for example, with lists like the corporate registry here, the land registry here, lists of politicians, any other list that you have or you may find, and maybe find more people in the data. But I want to leave with that the floor to Helena so that she can tell you how she actually did a great story at The Guardian on properties, doing some matching with the data. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. Hello. Yes, as Mar said, I've been working with the Panama Papers for The Guardian. I am the editor for the data projects at The Guardian, and I have been there for about a year and a half. And as Mar said, one of the most important things when I started working with this in September, when I came up to the secret room at the 4th floor at the Guardian house, was lists. So we wanted to find what people were there in the database. Were there any significant people in the database? So, for instance, we were, of course, interested in politicians, the House of Commons, the House of Lords. And one thing that is a little tricky is that when the House of Lords are listed on the Parliament website, they're only listed under their title. They're not listed under their family name. So you have to click on each one of them to get what their real name are, or not real name, but where their family name is. So what I had to do was sort of to collect all those addresses, all those URLs to each of the members, write a little script that downloaded all the files, then a little script.
I'm not touching anything.
Okay. Somebody is, I don't know what. Write a little script that cleaned out those files and then get the information that I needed so that I could identify, so that we could use both the titles and their family names to match. Another thing we did was, of course, to look at FIFA, as you know, and also the Olympic Committee. So I pulled a lot of PDFs, and anybody who is a data journalist in this room knows how much we hate PDFs. So I pulled the PDFs, I pulled the rights pages from the PDFs, and I cleaned them up, and I got the list of the members of the executive committee in FIFA. And we also looked at the rich lists. There are several rich lists. This is one of them. And even there, we had to sort of clean them up and put them together. And all these lists, whether there were members of FIFA executive committee, or it was the House of Lords, or it was the rich list, or were a lot of different lists, we ran them against the data to see what kind of hits we got. So we found, for instance, 6 members of the House of Lords. As you know, we found members of FIFA's committee, and we found many other people by running these lists. So that was sort of a first simple step when we started out, was sort of, can we find these people? But of course, the job doesn't stop with us finding a name. For every name we found, there was excruciating amounts of reporting, looking at documents in blacklight, but also, of course, looking at other sources and talking to other sources to make sure, one, that we had identified the correct Emma Watson, for instance, and two, what were the papers, what were the documents really saying about these people? Another thing, as Mar talked about, the data wasn't exactly the nicest piece of data I've ever seen. Quite the contrary, actually. And one of the things that we realized that we wanted was to describe how this system works, because this is a complicated system, and we wanted to describe for our readers how this system works. And one of the things that we wanted to look at was actually which countries are involved and how does this work internationally. So for a couple of weeks, I went through the data, coding the data so that we could see which countries the different companies and shareholders came from, for instance, and beneficiaries came from. So for instance, in the example here, the data says that this is a United Kingdom address, but we wanted, of course, to keep track of Jersey and Guernsey and Isle of Man. So that was important for us to say that even if it says United Kingdom, we want to code this as Jersey. And that meant that a lot of this I actually did by hand, by sort of looking through the data. I then, after doing this for several weeks, found out that Mar and her amazing team had done that programmatically, which actually, it had taken them a couple of days at least, but it turned out to be a very good thing, because by comparing the two lists, the list that I had done and the list that Mar's team had done, we could both find errors in there. Because the human, I mean, me, I also do errors. And we could actually get a better list. We actually got a better country list out of that. And I then got, this is what we got, this is what the count was. And we could do a graphic that I think is very simple, but it tells the story about how this works, where we have the hiding places where the companies are incorporated, the tax havens. We have the intermediaries, the people who help people incorporate, and they're in Switzerland, they're in Panama, they're in Hong Kong. And then we have the hidden owners, which are from all over the world, which are not concentrated to a single country. And the cleaning sort of continued. Another thing that we wanted to do was, of course, to match especially the company register with other company lists. And this is just one example on how, and Mar, I think that the data is a little cleaner than this now, right? You guys have done a little bit of cleanup. But this was very typical for them, where when a company changed name, for instance, they kept the old name and they just put an EX in front of that, and then they put in the new name in the same field, which made, of course, it impossible to match anything towards the new or the old name. So I went through this too with a little programming and mostly manual, to be honest, to sort of do a list where I cleaned up the name as good as possible, and then in some cases actually duplicated so that I would have a first company and a second company. The same thing was actually, this was a list that we got, it's from the land registry that contains all the companies that own property in the UK that has jurisdiction outside of the UK. So even here, also here, land registry, even though that data was a little cleaner, I did the same kind of cleanup there. Changed all the limited to LTD, for instance, to make it easier to match them. And what I basically then did was that I put the two lists that I had done into two tables, into a SQL database. But I also knew that Mossack Fonseca, I had seen when I went through the database, they had a lot of spelling errors. I also knew that even though we had jurisdictions on the companies, both from land registry and from Mossack Fonseca, I also had seen that those jurisdictions the quality of that was not very good. So what I did was that I did a match solely on the names that I had cleaned, and I also did a similarity match, which means that they only have to match to 90%. The names only have to match to 90%, which means that the query that I ran took 3 days for my computer to run. So I just, pressed the button and then I went and did other stuff for 3 days. But once I got it out of there, we got about 3,800 companies that I could then go through and look at, for instance, the jurisdictions and see, is there a match, isn't there a match, is there a match if the names are correct, if the jurisdiction is correct. And sometimes there were a match even when we saw obvious spelling errors, for instance. And with this data, who then was taken care of by an amazing reporter named David Pegg, who took this and started doing reporting on this, we did the story about the secret property empires of mostly London, to be honest. There were a couple of other properties, but mostly it was London properties. And we did this, which I'm very fond of, this amazing graphic where we went out and took pictures of all the properties and showed where the business leaders live, or the United Arab Emirates royal family, who has a lot of properties in London, where we, for the first time, actually could show how many they were. It's been known before, but not the vastness of it. The politicians, both UK and mostly foreign politicians, and the foreign officials who own the papers. So that is a couple of the stories.
Great. So I don't think we have much time, but we have a little bit of time for questions. So is there a microphone around? Or?
Yes.
So why don't you, since you're there, why don't you get that one? And then we'll go to you.
Where do you think
It is not working.
Where do you think are the biggest gaps that journalists should now be stepping in to fill now that it's all out there?
Bear in mind she's still working on stories. So that's a tricky question.
It is a tricky question. I think that there is gaps that you have to be aware of, that even though this is a vast database, Mossack Fonseca is just one company to start with. So we can't say anything about the offshore sort of in general. We can say some things, but I think that we sometimes have forgotten that this is just one company, and that's a gap. I think that one of the biggest pitfalls is, of course, that you have to do additional reporting. Don't believe just because you see something in the data, you have to do additional reporting. I think that is a rule for all reporting, but especially for this one.
So I would have to say that we worked on this for 1 year, but there are still so many stories that we probably didn't see. Emma Watson is a great example. There are others, like in Spain, there are a few other names that are just appearing by people looking into the database. Depends on whether your media organization is a local one or not. I think that this database is great for local reporters because it allows you to see so you could actually look at all the addresses in the UK, and then you could also, after that, narrate down to your city, right? So you can actually type in your city or just download the data, filter all the addresses in the UK, and look for your city. So some stories that are happening in Spain, for example, where I live, is a lot of local newspapers saying, and here are the two people from Navarra in the north of Spain, you know? And some of them turn out to be important people. So for example, there was a story about Cantabria, Santander, the city in the north of Spain, and the region. Basically, they found like a medalist from the Olympics that had an address there, and they also it had not been reported, that our Spanish partners didn't do work on, and they also found a person that it's an agent for soccer players, and he dealt with a couple of good soccer players. So basically, I would say if you're a local reporter, then it's great. Just look for your city, or I would suggest download the data, filter out the UK, filter out all the companies, all the companies connected to addresses from your region, and then try to match as much as possible with other things. So if we did some matches, and Helena explained some of the matches they did, but I'm sure there are many other matches. So for example, one thing we didn't do fully, but that we did in part, was to match with Wikipedia, the database behind Wikipedia. So we had to match. The problem is that we got a lot of false positives. So when you do massive matches between two data sets, you need to bear in mind that you need to carve out time to rule out false positives. You can download the data and run it through any database that your media house may have. So if you have access to, for example, there's Dow Jones Risk and Compliance database, which is great. We did not do it for security reasons up to now, but so I would suggest you put it into the format that they have and feed it, and then try to rule out false positives yourself. And then I have to say, eyeballing works too. The best names in Spain appeared because somebody started typing names in the database. So Almodóvar, the film director who was in the data, came because a reporter was looking into the documents, not the public section, but the documents, and he was like, let me see if Almodovar is here. And he just typed it in, and Almodovar was there. So maybe download the list and start eyeballing, maybe probably those names from the UK, but start eyeballing to see if that's not very scientific, but that has worked too. Or give that list to the most knowledgeable reporters in your organization. You know, these type of people that have the encyclopedia in their own brains, for them to look at the list, and then you can also get them to do the research. So those are some tips that I would recommend. So that person over there was the first one.
I got a colleague, exiled journalist. He's been working for 2 years on corruption and nepotism in his home country. Was very excited about the Panama Papers news because he knew there was a Panama connection already. He's one of Mars Gollum journalists. And so he sent an email in, and he was added to the mailing list. He asked me if I could get in touch so he could get hold of more of the data, and I got added to the mailing list. When it became available yesterday, on Monday, he ran the names through, and it kind of told him what he knew already, who the officials were and what the names of the companies. What he needs to see is the rest of the data, the documentation. How does he join the hallowed ranks of the 370? How does he get onto the 4th floor of the secret room of the Guardian?
So data at ICIJ.org, that's where we're collecting all the requests of access to the documents.
Yeah, he's tried that.
Well, so that's just for all of you that don't know, that's where we're collecting the requests. We have already a very big team of almost 400 reporters already, so it's growing. Every time we bring somebody on board, it requires a lot of work on our side. We have to train the reporters on how to use the systems, on how to read the documents, and how to mine the documents. And if you remember from this morning, we're a very small staff. ICIJ only has 12 full-time staff that deal with everything. So it's a capacity issue that we can only bring so many journalists to work with us, and I think 400 is already a big number. So we're bringing, since we published, we've brought on around 30 more journalists to work on the data. We've prioritized based on mainly countries that had not been covered or not covered well. And we will keep expanding. And so every request that gets to data at ICIJ.org is taken into consideration. And we expand the team based on what I said, countries that have not been covered, or other considerations into whether a country needs to be more fully covered. Or so I didn't quite follow who your colleague was, but we can talk afterwards, and you can tell me. But pardon?
I didn't say who it was.
Okay, so that we can talk about afterwards. But email data at ICIJ.org. Bear in mind that if we're already working with the media or 2 media organizations in the country, it's probably very unusual that you're going to get access to the data. So right now we're working with The Guardian and we're working with the BBC. They're still working on the papers and analyzing the documents. It's probably, I would say, quite rare that we add another British media organization. No, I know, and I'm just saying for the British audience that we have in front of us. But yeah, if you can email us, we are keeping a spreadsheet with everything and creating a database, and we hope to expand the team as much as possible within the resources we have.
Sorry to ask a very basic question, but how can we judge what is legal or illegal? For example, you gave us an example of Emma Watson, and if Emma Watson's name has appeared, then she seems to have some company through this law firm, but does that mean that she did something illegal? Therefore, as a journalist, should we pursue that issue?
Right. So this is the first question that our editors asked us when we started starting this investigation. And there's a big legal disclaimer that you have to accept when you get into the database that says that having an offshore company is legal, and that we're not saying that there's anything illegal or any illegal activity in anybody that appears in this database. The tricky issue dealing with this is that we know that it's legal, but why would you go to Panama to create a company. It's not like it's around the corner. I mean, Jersey's around the corner, but Panama, why would you go to Panama or the British Virgin Islands, right? To create a company. And the reason, in the majority of cases, it's because you want to hide something. We found cases of couples that were divorcing, and the husband didn't want to split the wealth with his wife. We had many husbands, more than wives, trying not to share the wealth with their wives, and they went and created offshore structures, right? Is that illegal? No, but probably morally unethical or borderline ethical. And anyway, so basically, there's no way for us to know as journalists whether something is illegal. The documents sometimes help to see if they're hiding something, they're avoiding taxes, evading taxes. But that's the tricky thing. So I guess that's probably also why we looked at public figures. Because, if a politician appears in the data and it's a prime minister, like the Prime Minister of Iceland, and the Prime Minister of Iceland has not reported that he had this offshore company, and then he kind of like denies it when you do an interview with him and he walks out of the interview, then there's a story, right? It's very important to say that we contacted everybody that when we did a full story about that people, we contacted everybody. And I would encourage you that if you do stories about this data, you also call people in advance to hear their side of the story.
Yeah, and just want to emphasize that for me, as a Swedish journalist, for the first time working at a big project at The Guardian, I am actually very impressed by both the reporters and our legal team that went through every single line that we wrote, sometimes 2 and 3 and 4 times, and the importance of sort of contacting people, writing letters to people saying that this is what we found and this is what we're going to report on you. And as Mar said, it's not illegal to have an offshore company. And there could be, as an expert once said, there are a very, very, very handful reasons, a very small part of the population where it actually makes sense to put a company offshore. But that is a very, very small part of the population and not the vastness of the people that we see in the database.
So do we have time for one last question? If there is, yeah. Are there any questions? Because I saw some questions in the back. So could we just get these 2 questions? So, sorry, Rina, to make you walk. No.
Shall I just shout? Can you hear? Okay. Do you think you can learn anything about where requests for the information now are coming from as well in your open database?
If we what?
Do you think you might learn anything new in regards to where requests for information to your database are now coming from? I'm just wondering if you've seen any. So I don't know if you're tracking sort of where people are requesting information. Where
you mean searching or
searching.
asking us? So I have to say and then there was a question at the back, Rina. But I'll answer that very quickly. And we're in a Google-sponsored conference, but I have to say Google Analytics crashed on us and didn't allow us to have very good analytics in the first hours or days. Probably you'll be able to get a better report today, but it was not giving us a very, very good analytics yet. We have some ideas on what people are searching, and you see some in the popular searches. People are searching a lot, like for Trump. People are searching a lot for US-based things. We're also getting traffic. Depends on when our partners publish from places where they go crazy, like Mongolia. All of a sudden, we got all this traffic from Mongolia. And I have to say, Chinese-related names have been very popular in the past, even though our sites are censored in China. But I guess they can be accessed from Hong Kong, and that's probably where it's coming from.
Hi, Mar. This is something of a devil's advocate question, but just building on what was said a moment ago. As I understand it, Emma Watson's particular reason is that she didn't want anyone to know where she lives. As a female celebrity, we can understand there might be very good reasons that she wouldn't want her residential property address in the public domain. I can imagine a lot of people having engaged a law firm to make sure that their address, for instance, remain private, might not have any idea where the companies might be set up. So there's a sort of a factual question. I'm interested, how many clients of Mossack Fonseca are sort of contained within the papers, and what proportion you think have done anything illegal or immoral? And the sort of the more general question is there a danger in investigative journalism going from the very precise smart bomb, we follow a particular lead on the basis of a tip-off, to this newer model, which is sort of maybe more of a carpet bombing approach, which is that we take all of this data, confidential, legally privileged, whatever it is, and we fish until we find the story? Are there ethical problems in that model?
So you're talking about fishing into the data, the documents, or do you mean publishing the data?
I mean, a shift from investigative journalism starting with a specific tip and then chasing it down to a model of investigative journalism, whether it's WikiLeaks or Offshore or Panama Papers, which starts with a huge data set but no particular story, and then fishes within data that includes a lot of stuff that isn't story.
Okay.
Are there ethical problems in that change?
Got it.
I mean, I think to start with, I think that is maybe a way to describe it that is not exactly true, because for each tip that we got by matching, we did that. We did exactly what you're describing. We're doing as I said, we're doing the conventional reporting of looking at the documents, talking to the experts, looking at public sources, doing sort of everything from verifying that. I think that is really important. You're raising an important point, because I think that is, one person once said to me that you should look at the database as you look upon an interview person or as a source. It's like a source. It can lie to you if you're not, just like a source. You have to ask the right questions, otherwise you won't get the information you need, just like a source. So I think that it's really important, especially with a data like this that is leaked, is that we do our duty and do the conventional reporting that we have to do. So in that way, I don't agree with your generalization. And actually, in one way, for me as a data journalist, we here have a possibility to see the whole system, to not just get a tip about Messi or about Almodovar or about Stanley Kubrick. What's in the data, right?
Or the wife or something.
Yeah. Sorry. We don't get just that one tip. We can show this system. We can show that it's not just one person, that we can, we've always known this. We can see that this is everybody. This is small, this is people from all places. This is rich people, of course, but it's people from all different kinds of areas. And we can show the system, how this works, with access to this data. But we have to stay journalists. You're right about that. We have to stay journalists. We have to stay investigative journalists and do our due diligence and look at the things and do additional reporting. That's why this is so important. But the matching is the step where we actually know that we are not just picking the first name or picking, we are actually looking at the whole picture.
Right, and in that sense about the system, this is the fourth offshore investigation we do at the ICIJ. So we were like, okay, how can we do this differently, right? And the main thing was, let's not do a name story. Like, okay, let's get the 5 people in the data that we think are great. And we knew about the Prime Minister in Iceland for a year. We could have just gone out of with Prime Minister in Iceland, a couple of more names, and it would have sounded great. I remember the German reporters told me a year ago, hey, we already have 10 good stories. I think we can publish. And we could have gone with that. We tried to look at how the system worked and what were the patterns in the system. One of the most fascinating patterns was that of the behavior of banks. There were more than 500 banks in the data that had requested Mossack Fonseca to incorporate around 16,000 companies. The patterns, if you looked at the timeline, were very interesting because there was a huge rise and 2004, 2005 especially, then the market plateaued, or the requests plateaued, and then it went down in 2010. If you do investigation into what was happening at that time, well, actually in 2005, there was an implementation of a directive, European Savings Directive, which was requesting banks to actually withhold tax of clients that were Europeans and maybe had a bank account in Switzerland. And we actually have seen through the documents how banks have been advising clients, okay, well, I have to withhold tax if you're a person, if you're a physical person, but if you're a company, then I don't have to do it. So why don't you create an offshore company? And nobody will know that you're behind it. And that's one of the reasons in the spike. Why does it decline? Well, the U.S. starts clamping down on or asking information to Switzerland about their U.S. citizens, with the UBS case and other cases. And all of a sudden we see emails in the system that tell us how banks started using other strategies, right? I think that the reason why we looked into the documents for such a long time was to try to find those patterns of the system and how the system worked, and not just say, hey, this one name and this other and this other. I think this is where we're heading, how to deal with massive amount of information. I think it's a fascinating challenge for journalism. We've learned at the ICIJ of over several leaks instead of trying to throw names to see what do you find. Of course, you want to try to find the King of Spain, and you want to try to find, the president. But let's try to, instead of coming from the outside into the data and dive into the data, let's try to see what the data tells us and build the story from there. In some cases it's easier, and some cases it's more complicated. So for example, a lot of the data about beneficial owners was inside documents, so it was very difficult to do that analysis. But technology helps us. One thing we didn't do that we would like to do is content analysis with text mining, complex text mining, techniques that basically would tell us what are the topics or the words or the names and the entities involved in documents. So I think we have even a room for improvement. And in that sense, I do think that it's very difficult to give answers to your questions about how much is it illegal. Well, if I was the tax agency in my country, I would be able to tell you. But I don't know, because the problem is having an offshore company is legal. What it's illegal is not to report it back home. And that is not public information, except in crazy countries like Sweden. But, so that's why it's important for us to publish the data, or at least as much of the data as we can, in the Offshore Leaks database, because I hope HMRC and my Spanish tax agency and tax agencies around the world are starting to match this data with, their great databases of people to see whether they report it or not. Back in 2013, when we published the Offshore Leaks database, in South Korea, they recovered millions in unpaid taxes because people had not reported it back home. So this is what the project is about exposing secrecy and exposing a system that is opaque and happens in parallel to the economy that you and I belong to. And I think with that, we're over time. Thank you very much for coming. We're always available for questions later.